Eleanor, daughter of Maximus, was an adventurer, like her father before her. Now, old and retired, Maximus had spent the last days of his life in their old family home, a small wooden house in the middle of Whitewater Falls, a small village of human farmers, blacksmiths, and other working-class commoners. It had been many years since Eleanor had seen Maximus last, as the last time they had communicated through Raven. She was merely a year into her adventuring. As a child, Eleanor didn't have a close relationship with her father, aside from him constantly being away from her and her mother, Rosary. When he was home, he came off as cold and distant. Unfortunately, Rosary would pass away to illness while Maximus was away on one of his adventures. The last of his adventures, as he would need to be home now for his daughter. As a new adult, Eleanor still had bitterness towards Maximus, often blaming him for Rosary's passing. Like the apple that fell from the tree, however, Eleanor found herself in the same line of work as the man she held such a deep-rooted grudge against. She had never known that being an adventurer wasn't simply going out and finding trouble, fighting bandits and monsters, or hunting for ancient artifacts. It was quite a reality check to discover that adventuring was an actual, legitimate job that paid very well, enough in fact, to raise a family off. She began to wonder if she had, perhaps, been too harsh on Maximus, that his distance was necessary for the comfortable lifestyle they had lived until her mother's passing. Like Maximus before her, Eleanor often frequented the Usurper's Dagger, a bar found at the edge of the village, where there were often many adventuring jobs posted on large yellow boards, and Eleanor took advantage of many of them as she could. Eventually, she would leave the small village of Whitewater Falls to bigger cities and better-paying adventures. Many years later, Eleanor found herself returning to Whitewater Falls, but something was different. Something was wrong. As she began to get closer to the village, she began to notice the first signs of things being weirdly out of place. Out of nowhere, heavy rain began to fall. She looked up to see that the bright, shining sun was now covered by ominous storm clouds. She hadn't noticed these storm clouds prior to arriving, nor was there ever any indication that there would be anything but sunshine. She didn't think too much about it and continued on until she finally reached that old familiar welcome sign. Welcome to Whitewater Falls, population 451. As soon as her horse took its first step inside the town border, Eleanor felt a cold shiver down her spine, and it wasn't due to the cold rain. Something was definitely off. She slowly continued on and looked around the streets. For a population of 451, it seemed like a ghost town. She reasoned that because of the heavy rain, everyone must be inside. But then she began to notice that there were no candles lit in any of the homes or businesses, and there were no people that she could see through the windows, and not even a single horse other than her own was out and about. This just seemed so wrong to her. Despite being such a small town, Whitewater Falls was always full of life, even in the worst of weather-related conditions, rain being a fairly common occurrence. What had happened in the time that she had left until now? Eleanor thought of her father as her horse slowly walked through the town. Eventually, she made her way back to her old house. It looked exactly the same, but at the same time, like the rest of the town, something was off. She walked her horse into the stable, noting that her father's horse was nowhere to be seen. She wondered if he was home, or even still lived there, or even still lived at all. She gently knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. She knocked a few more times, harder and for longer, but still, nothing. She then began to knock loudly and shouted for her father. "Hello?" she yelled, trying to see through the living room window. It was dark, but she could barely make out the silhouette of a human-shaped figure sitting in her father's large seat, which, as a child, he had called his throne. "Father!" she yelled some more. He just sat there unmoving. Eleanor began to panic, worried that he might have had a heart attack or a stroke or anything else. She frantically began to kick at the door, over and over again, until it finally gave. She hurried inside and immediately ran over to the throne, expecting to see her father. What was sitting in that chair, waiting for her, was not her father. At least, at the time, she didn't recognize it as her father. It was old and withered. Its skin was grey and paper thin. There was no hair anywhere on its body and its eyes. Its eyes were empty and lifeless. "Father?" Eleanor choked out. Its eyes then darted to look at her, and she shrieked. It stood up as she stepped away, its arms outstretched towards her. It opened its mouth as if to speak, but all that came out was a stream of disgusting-looking water. The water then began to pour out of every other orifice on its face, its eyes, nose, and ears. Panicking, she grabbed her sword from its sheath and swung as hard as she could, striking its face. As the impact landed, its head burst into a watery explosion. The rest of its body then fell apart as well, covering the entire floor in the liquefied remains of this thing. Eleanor had seen many things on her adventures. She had faced many beasts and monsters, and seen some of the darkest magics conceived. But this broke her. She fell to her knees and vomited onto the floor and wailed in horror. After composing herself, she picked herself up and walked outside, to be confronted by a horror the likes she had never experienced. There were images in the rain, the raindrops forming in such a way that it looked as though an army of waterborne monsters were waiting for her, ready to strike. Understanding her chances of victory were null, Eleanor ran to the stable, but stopped at the image of her dear companion of many years lying dead on the ground, soaked in water. "No!" she cried as she gripped her blade tighter. Running through the rain, cutting her way through wave after wave of the cold, wet horrors, she made her way to the edge of the town and beyond. Though her heart felt as if it would leap from her chest and her lungs felt as though they would burst, she pushed onward until she was out of the rain-covered lands. Falling to her knees, she sobbed and sobbed until she took a deep breath and let out an agonizing scream of pain and sorrow. Soaked, cold, and exhausted, she stumbled her way to the next town over. She knew she would need to alert the guard about the dark magic that infected Whitewater Falls. After pleading to be seen, she was finally brought before the captain of the guard, and as she was about to explain what happened, she vomited. Cold, clear water was expelled from her throat as dark storm clouds formed over the town.